Hi, my name is Rick McCourt. I'm a botanist here at the Academy of Natural Sciences. I take care of the plant collection of about 1.6 million specimens, and I take care of a number of different things here, and one of them is the herbarium, which is our plant collection. And that's where we keep dried, pressed plant specimens that have been collected by scientists over the past several centuries. This is a special room where we don't come in very often with guided tours because it has a lot of very important specimens here. There are a lot of scientifically important specimens looked at by specialists all over the world, and there are also historically important collections here as well. And one of them, probably the most famous one, is the herbarium or the plant collection of the explorers Lewis and Clark, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. They went on a cross-country trip, or at least from St. Louis to the Pacific coast and back again, in 1804 to 1806. I think everyone has heard of Lewis and Clark, but not everybody knows what they were up to. In addition to looking for what was then sort of the holy grail of transportation, a water route on rivers from St. Louis to the western shore so they could use it for commerce, they were also told by President Thomas Jefferson, who commissioned them to do the trip, to collect plants and animals, to make natural history observations, and make a lot of maps. So they came back with a huge number of things, including journals. These are facsimiles. These are not the actual journals themselves, but they look like them. These are 3 out of a series of, maybe 20 or so books that they wrote in for 2 years. And they wrote notes about the people they met, the Native Americans they encountered. They drew pictures and sketches, and they also wrote natural history notes, a lot about what they called vegetables of the area, which we call plants too. Because at that time, plants were, of course, very important. Jefferson himself and several other founding fathers were gardeners or farmers, and so finding plants and cultivating them was a really important task. So they wanted to know what was out there in the West. When Meriwether Lewis took on the job, he started in 1804, but just a year earlier, President Jefferson had acquired the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon Bonaparte. And it suddenly doubled the size of the United States, and it made it legal and part of our territory for Meriwether Lewis to explore it. One of the more important things for us here in Philadelphia is that he started the trip kind of here. President Jefferson sent him to Philadelphia, which was the biggest city in the country at the time, also the most sophisticated and scientifically the most important place in the country, because he wanted him to get special training in the sciences, in medicine, in geology, in fossils, and also especially in botany. So he came here to learn how to collect plants, how to press them, how to preserve them, and how to observe and make scientifically valid observations of them, so he could bring all that information back and deliver it to Thomas Jefferson, and also publish a book about it for the world. Sadly, that never happened, but we still know about it for a very good reason. Meriwether Lewis and Clark and about 3 dozen men, plus Sacagawea, and including the African-American slave of Clark York, set out on a journey that took them about 6,000 miles from St. Louis to the Pacific and back, and they collected 232 plant specimens that survived and made it back here to the East Coast. This is not a trivial task. It takes really great care to go out, collect the plant, pick it just right, press it between a couple of papers, inside of a couple of boards, make sure that they're dry, and then bring it back safe and intact and keep it in really good condition. If you've ever tried to keep any flower alive at home, you know that's a hard task to do. But if you press a rose in between the pages of a book, it can actually last there for many generations. And that's essentially what Lewis was doing. So these cabinets here contain 222 specimens that Lewis collected and brought back, gave to Jefferson, and eventually they made their way here to the Academy. They're actually shown on this poster here, where they're all laid out. And you can see they're kind of brown because they've lost all the color, all the green and all the flower color. But they're really, some of them, quite beautiful things. And I'm going to show you a couple right now. So this cabinet is especially made so it actually keeps moisture out, keeps bugs out if they should ever make their way into the room, which they rarely do. There are little rubber gaskets around the edge so that when it's closed tight, it's very safe inside. And these special folders in here where we keep the plants. What I'm going to show you is this one today, because it's particularly interesting. So this is a case we're using, our folder that we use to protect the plant when it's in storage. We can open it, just like a book. We actually have a little space here to keep the plant from being disturbed anymore. So this is what we call an herbarium sheet. You can see there's actually a plant specimen, a couple of them laid out on it here. And there's a bunch of pieces of paper. Those pieces of paper are not just graffiti, but they're actually scientific information. And they're what makes the specimen really important to science, because they tell what the plant is in terms of a scientific name. They tell where it was collected, the date it was collected, who collected it, and then have other little bits and pieces of information that might be useful about it. So this will take you, if you start here, this will take you to the library where you can read more about the species, about the collection, about the area where it was collected and everything else. It's really the launch pad for exploration of botanical material. And that's why these plant specimens, 222 of them, are so important. This one is actually the property of the American Philosophical Society, which was the scientific society at the time that of the late 1700s. Benjamin Franklin helped co-found it. Thomas Jefferson was the president of that society. It's not usual nowadays that we have presidents who have the equivalent of a PhD knowledge in science, but Jefferson did. He was quite a man of many talents. And so he was the president of that society, and they became affiliated with Jefferson and his collection, so they own quite a few of these specimen sheets. So we have a little tag here, and we take care of them for the American Philosophical Society, which is across town here in Philadelphia. Then if you look up a little closer, we have other tags on this and other indicating marks here. One of the more modern things you might see here is a couple of barcodes. It turns out those are very useful for us to keep track of things on a computer nowadays. Lewis and Clark didn't have barcodes, obviously, and so these were applied much later, probably within the past 10 years. There are also some other typed out labels by people who have studied this. The name actually of this species has changed over time because we learned more about the diversity of plant life on Earth, and sometimes we have to change names to keep the record straight, kind of like adjusting or correcting birth certificates if you find errors and things like that. But really interesting for most people is that here on this piece of paper, there are a couple of labels that are 216 years old now. One of them at the bottom here is actually in Meriwether Lewis's own handwriting. He wrote little tags on these things, put them in with the plants when they were being collected and pressed, and then kept them together. Unfortunately, many of them were transcribed by somebody later, and they just thought, well, this is not important. They threw them away because they had other notes. But we have about 34 of these with original handwriting of Meriwether Lewis from the actual expedition. So this one actually says, found September 2nd, the Indians use it as an application to fresh wounds. They put it on bruises and then wet the leaves a little and then apply them directly to the fresh wound. So this is a little bit of ethnobotanical knowledge, medicinal knowledge that Lewis is recording in the note so that we know what the plant was used for. It turns out it's a species of clover, purple prairie clover, which is hard to say 5 times fast, but the purple prairie clover is a very common plant. It grows from Saskatchewan all the way down to Mexico on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains. And it was actually known to science at the time, but Lewis had never seen it before. And he wrote in his journal, "It's a stranger to me." And so his job was to find new and unusual plants. And so he was looking all over for things that might not have been found or discovered before by scientists. And that's why he brought them back. So the other tag on here, which is almost the same age, is this one, which says, on the Missouri, August 22nd, 1806. So this is the same species, but collected 2 years apart. And that tag was put here by a German botanist named Friedrich Persch. When Lewis came back, he didn't have the scientific acumen and training to write up a voluminous book about these. But he found a botanist who could do this, named Friedrich Persch, who was working in Philadelphia at the time. Friedrich Persch looked at every single plant, talked to Lewis, transcribed some of his notes, and wrote his other own new notes. And then he later published a 2-volume work. This is a 1-volume piece of it. It's a facsimile, so it wasn't published in the 1800s, but it was published, reproduced much later. The original publication, though, came out in 1813. And he wrote up for science and sort of immortalized all the specimens that Lewis had collected. Otherwise, these plants would have just been stored in a cabinet and probably never been found again. because Lewis was not equipped to write the book, and he went away and through a series of other events, he died without ever having written a word about these plants. So Persh's book really ensured for science that we would have a record of what Lewis had done. Once Lewis brought them back and Persh wrote them up, the plants actually were stored away kind of out of sight and out of mind for about 80 years. Persh, who had worked with Lewis, left town in about 1807, and he went to New York and then on to London, and without telling anyone, he actually took with him about 50 or so plant specimens from Lewis and Clark's plant collection, and they're in these cabinets as well. He had things he wanted to take a special look at, and he wrote his book in London, so this thing on the table here, this book was published there. He came back, the plants actually stayed in London, and they probably would still be in England today, except the gentleman who had them in a collection there died and they were auctioned off, and in the audience was fortuitously an American scientist who put a bid on a box of American plants. He didn't know what was in there, and he came back to the United States. It turned out he had all the Lewis plants. And so by that time, some of the plants had remained here, and the plants from London had come back. They were united and put together, and they came over to the Academy in about 1896, and that's where they've been ever since. They're still used by scientists today. People can still find all of these plants out in the wild. This book called Lewis and Clark's Green World was done by Jim Reveal and Scott Earle, two scientists who have worked on the collection. On the cover are two plants that were named by Persh in honor of the explorers. The top one is Lewisia, and the bottom one is Clarkia. So their names became immortalized in science, even though they didn't quite write the book they wanted to. We still use these as reference materials today. It's kind of like a land title that verifies property ownership and identity. And so we have to keep them. We can't just take a picture of them and throw them away. We need to keep these things kind of forever. Interestingly enough, we can do some science on them too. If little bits and pieces have fallen off over the years, you can take those little pieces and you can actually study the genetic material in them, the DNA, or sometimes other chemicals that can be used to examine what the atmosphere and the environmental surroundings were like when the plants were growing. So there's a lot of uses that can be made of these plants and other plants in our collection, and we're very excited to keep them here and keep them safe.